A patron asked about a year ago if we would do a program on Quanah Parker. I got on the internet, and there are a number of books, but this one book came out loud and clear. It was, first of all, the only book that I knew of or could find that was endorsed by Quanah Parker's grandson. And I've seen the letter to prove it. And that sent me a loud message. The second reason this book was endorsed by one of the most eminent historians in America today, Robert Utley. That sent another loud message. And I wondered if it's possible that we could possibly get Bill Neeley here tonight. And we have. He drove 4 hours. He teaches at Columbia College at Fort Sill. And I have a letter that his dean has written, and I'd like to read it. To our friends at the Allen Public Library, greetings from the Fort Sill, Oklahoma community. We are so happy to share Bill with you, and as we know that you will find his presentation both informative and interesting. Fort Sill and Comanche country are so rich in the history and culture of many Native American tribes, but Quanah Parker has a special place in our hearts. On behalf of Fort Sill, I welcome you all to visit Fort Sill and see the wonderful historic buildings and museums that we have. I hope that Bill's talk will encourage you to learn more about our community. When I was a young lad, my grandmother was from the panhandle of Texas, and she came from a family of 6 kids. They all lived in the panhandle, so each Thanksgiving, each Christmas, we would truck up to the panhandle. There was no Interstate 35. We went the long way. And invariably, at each Thanksgiving and Christmas meal, the subject of Quanah Parker was raised. And as a young lad, I didn't pay close attention, but I wish I had. And each one of them had a Quanah Parker story. I don't know whether they were true or not true, but every one of them did. But it tells me as an adult how important the Quanah Parker was to all over the panhandle. Then, in junior high, I was in the Boy Scouts, and I went down to Fort Parker, down near Groesbeck, Texas, where the fort has been reconstructed, and we heard the story about Cynthia Ann Parker. And as an adult, I realized that except for possibly the Alamo and San Jacinto, this is unquestionably the most sensational and important Native American and Texas history story, the story of Cynthia Ann Parker and Quanah Parker. Now, tonight's program is being videotaped for future broadcast on Channel 16. The only thing that ever makes me mad in life is when we're giving a scholastic presentation and the cell phones go off. Please turn them off because it will interrupt the videotape. We have a very special guest tonight before I introduce Bill Neeley. I, for many years, have listened to the program on KNON called Beyond Bows and Arrows. And I realized last Monday after talking to this gentleman that he was one of the producers or writers or DJs for that program. He also represents the Native American Arts Council. But one reason that we consider his attendance such a great honor tonight, he is the great-great-grandson of Quanah Parker. Bhakta Books is about education and it's about entertainment, but it's also about building bridges. And tonight we hope a bridge is built. Quanah Parker is probably one of his greatest legacies is what he taught us about the Great Spirit. And Bill Neeley tonight is going to tell us about Quanah Parker and his legacy.
Thank you, Tom. As you can see, I came as Bill tonight. decided not to wear a suit, and I'm just me. And we're going to talk about the great Quanah Parker, and I'm so glad that his flesh and blood is with us tonight. And among the Comanches, it's not good to mention the name of those who have gone to the spirit world, but I think Quanah's spirit will forgive us tonight if we use his name. I'm a native Texan. I live in Lawton, Oklahoma. I've pretty much adopted southwestern Oklahoma. Lawton is in Comanche County. Lawton came to life in 1901 out of what had been the Comanche Kiowa Apache Reservation. When they broke that reservation up, Lawton became a town. And I have lived there before. I was director of education at 2 different museums in southwestern Oklahoma. And I came back to Texas to teach Spanish for a couple of years in the Fort Worth area. And I am a multicultural person. I know a little bit of Arabic, having lived in Saudi Arabia for 3 years. I taught English over there. So I want to talk to you about cultures in collision. And Tom, who has done a marvelous job in putting this program together, talked about bridge building. And that's how I see myself as an author and as a speaker. We have to write about the conflicts because they happened. We can't rewrite the history. We have to acknowledge it the way it really was, if we can figure that out. But we also don't pass judgment on the people who did things that we might not approve of because they were living in their own time period. So therefore, they have to be accepted as the way they were, not the way we would like for them to have been. So I think history for me is the story of what happened and why it happened. Let me rephrase that. What did the people do? Why did they do it? And what were the consequences? So tonight I want to talk about a great man who was caught in the middle of a horrible cultural conflict that became violent. And that was, of course, the great chief. And I too have been down to Groesbeck to the restored Parker's Fort, and it's not that far from here. And if you haven't been there, you should see it. It is the scene of the capture of Cynthia Ann Parker in 1836 by some Comanches and allied bands. They were there not to be mean because they wanted to be mean. They were there to run the invaders out of their country. They were very wise people. They knew that the more the non-Indians came into their territory, the bigger the foothold they got, the harder it would be to get rid of them. And they didn't want them because wherever these settlers came, the buffalo disappeared and never returned. And remember, the buffalo was the very basis of the Comanches' material lives. They were very spiritual as well and continue to be. We are in a public place, and I hope that you will say a private prayer because in Indian country, no meeting begins without a prayer. So let's all have a prayer in our heart that God will direct our thoughts and will help me to speak with a straight tongue. I am a native Texan. As I said, I'm from the Texas Panhandle. I'm from the farm. I'm a rural person. And that's another reason I like Lawton because I've got the wildlife refuge there. And I can go see the baby buffalo calves or the baby longhorn calves, and I can get away from, people if I need to. Sometimes I need to get away from myself, and there's a place out there I go to pray. I call it my Garden of Eden. But let's look at this incredible war bonnet. And this is not a peace bonnet. This is a war bonnet. Quanah wore this headdress in the Battle of Blanco Canyon, that I write about in my book in 1871. He wore this headdress when he led the attack on Adobe Walls in 1874. Adobe Walls was an outpost in the Texas Panhandle, just outside of where Borger is today. It was to supply the buffalo hunters that were killing the buffalo in huge numbers. So Quanah, after consulting with the spirits and with his friend Essetai, decided that he was going to lead an attack on the buffalo hunters. Now, what would we do if we had invaders in our country now that were trying to destroy our way of life? I know what we'd do. So do you. All right, so Essetai, and we'll see his picture later, he was a Comanche medicine man, and his name in Comanche is rear end of a wolf. That was his name. He was also known as White Eagle, and he was a very, very powerful medicine man. He was Quanah's friend and sometimes rival, and they both belonged to the Quahati band. So Essetai said, let's have a spiritual get together, and let's have a council, and we're going to go up there and kill those buffalo hunters. So he told all of them that the buffalo hunters would be killed in their sleep, but warned them not to eat a skunk on the way. Remember, that's important. All right, this is a high drawing of Quanah killing one of the buffalo hunters. That's Quanah with the big headdress. All right, now that headdress that we just saw, those feathers had to be taken from live eagles. Okay, live eagles. Okay, so let's remember that. All right, the battle didn't go too well, though. Quanah was this is Essetai. This is Essetai, a very powerful person, and I'm very careful in Comanche country of what I say about him, because even though he tried to take over the leadership of the Comanches from Quanah later on, he ultimately was Quanah's friend. And he was a tragic member, too, of that situation where he knew that the people had to depend on the buffalo, and the buffalo were being killed. Kind of what's happening to our dollar right now, sort of, maybe, and our gas prices, and we're feeling a little anxiety about our way of life as well. Okay, so on the way, some Cheyennes killed and ate a skunk. Now, in our culture, we're thinking, what were they thinking? Couldn't they find any rabbits or, anything else? But evidently the Cheyenne liked skunk, but that's a part of the story. They get to Adobe Walls, and the one hunter leaves early to go down to the river to get his horses, and he sees this line of just as the sun is coming up, this long line strung out. And of course, in my book, I write the eyewitness account from this fellow. Right now, I'm not eloquent enough to describe it to you, except that it must have been one of the most terrifying things that ever happened in this young man's life. Billy Dixon. He later won the Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery in the Indian Wars. So he alerts everybody. Well, before that, allegedly a lodgepole had broken in Hanrahan's saloon. I think that he shot a pistol off because somebody had alerted him to this attack. When you have 300 warriors and they have been in a council on the reservation, and which Fort Sill was set up for, to keep an eye on the Indians and bring them back into the reservation. But when you've got that many people, you can't keep a secret. So there was an Army scout from one of the Army posts in Oklahoma that showed up at Adobe Walls and alerted Hanrahan, the saloon keeper. That's a good name, isn't it, for a saloon keeper? Hanrahan. Okay, so here these guys were. There was no telegraph. There was nothing. There were no railroads. They were in the middle. They might as well have been in the middle of darkest Africa. And here came the natives. But Quanah and Essatai did not know that the buffalo hunters had even a more terrible new weapon, the 50 caliber Sharps rifle. So not only that, they had walls to hide behind, but the Indians were very brave. Quanah backed his horse up to the saloon door and tried to have the horse to kick it in. He got up on top of the saloon. They were shooting bullets up, through the roof. He was shooting down. And it was really a terrible fight. And 13 Indians were killed, and Quanah was wounded. And if he hadn't had a canteen, slung over his shoulder, he would have been killed. The bullet hit it, and he did receive a flesh wound, a shoulder wound. Well, he was the leader, and all of a sudden, they began to lose their resolve. Well, bravery can only go so far, and as Tom pointed out a while ago, in his reading of the book, this is Quanah later on. He was a very handsome man, and he liked getting his picture taken. Crazy Horse never would let them take his picture, but the Native American tribes are not all the same, and people within the tribe are not all the same, and we're all tribal here. Every person here I'm from a Scotch-Irish tribe, and I'm sure they were very, very savage when they got mad. Don't you imagine? And all of us are tribal people. This is how we all started, but we're all not the same within those tribes. So the Comanches and their allies lost the Battle of Adobe Walls, but they lost more because they realized that it was hopeless, that they could not defeat the army, the buffalo hunters. They realized that their way of life was coming to an end, and what a heartbreaking thing that must have been. All right, this is Quanah at the county fair in Lawton, Oklahoma, early after it was established. I can only imagine what he was thinking. Now, that's his ceremonial headdress. That was not. The war bonnet is in the University of California at Berkeley, in a museum there. This bonnet is in the Panhandle Plains Museum in Canyon, where I wrote the book. I was living in Amarillo, and I had a study carrel at the Panhandle Plains Museum, and I donated all my research materials there. Quanah probably wanted to kill some of those guys. Wouldn't you, if they had come and taken your land? And yet, we're talking about bridge building, aren't we? He realized that he had no choice but to adapt, and he did become friends with some white people. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. All right, this is another striking picture. See, this is a military saddle. When Quanah finally did have to go into surrender in 1875, he was never defeated in battle. But the women and children were hungry, and the soldiers were in the country looking for them. So he went to Blanco Canyon, between just east of Lubbock, and he went up on a butte, and a member of the family is the one who related this story to me, and he prayed for guidance, because he could have gone down in a blaze of glory and not had to deal with all the heartache and the transition period, but he knew that the people needed him, so he chose not to die in battle. But he saw an eagle flying toward him, and the eagle turned and flew toward Fort Sill. And a wolf howled in the canyon and looked up at him and turned and trotted toward Fort Sill. So he knew that that's what he was supposed to do. Spiritual. Some people ask me, well, are you Native American? No. Then why did you write this book? Well, I felt led to spiritually led to. And I believe that James Cox, Quanah's grandson that wrote the foreword to my book, would not have helped me if I hadn't if he hadn't felt something spiritual there and deep respect for the Comanches. He didn't want to talk to me, but we white people are not supposed to be too aggressive, but we are anyway. And then you have a writer who wants to tell a story, and Mr. Cox had never given an interview to anyone, so I kept on calling, and he was pretty rude on the phone, and then one time I called, and his wife Marie was on the other line. And she says, "Now, James, why don't you just let him come by and stay for 5 minutes? And if you don't like him, well, then he can leave." He says, "Oh, all right." So they lived in Midwest City, which is a suburb of Oklahoma City. So I went up there, and he was very rude for about the first 5 minutes, and then he suddenly changed. And we became friends at that moment and were until his untimely death. Mr. Cox realized that the Comanches needed a tribal headquarters, and so Quanah's grandson, chairman of the tribe, he gets the land and builds the complex. There's a beautiful complex north of Lawton, and Mr. Cox insisted that I speak at the dedication of the Quanah Parker Trailway between Lawton and Altus. So I did speak there, and Mrs. Cox was sitting next to me, and I felt her elbow, and she pointed up. There was an eagle flying. Well, I freaked out all the white people that were not used to the Indian country. I said in my speech, I said, "Quanah is flying above us now. You can look up and see him." Well, the journalist for the Wichita Falls paper just couldn't believe it, and so he writes this thing. Some of them said they saw a Quanah up in the sky. Now, if you're around Indian people, then the spiritual part is very real to them. It's very real to me. I'll tell you something that you might not believe, but it happened. It took me 3 years to write the book. I was living with my mother in Amarillo. She needed me with her. She was a widow. And I was scraping enough dimes together to go to Norman or to Lawton to study. And then I could always go down the hill to Canyon to study in the museum. Of course, I went to Lubbock, and I went to Austin and National Archives and Library of Congress and everywhere. But I've forgotten what I was going to say, but it's senior moment right there. Oh, it was so difficult. I just said, I just can't do this. I mean, this is hard enough to write. I don't have enough money to do all the research I need to do. And so I was riding around in my battered blue pickup out in the country one day, and I had my yellow pads that I wrote on. I hand wrote the biography. And this yellow pad levitated about a foot off the seat. And then it dropped back down, and I says, "Okay, I'll finish it." All right, so I'm serious. That's what happened. All right, this is Quanah and Tom Burnett. Before Lawton became a town in 1901, the Comanches had their reservation, 3 million acres, and they ran their own cattle and horses on it. But, the enterprising Texans were not far away, just across the river. So they thought, that grass is so good and we've got so many cattle. Why don't we get with Quanah and see if we can get at least that grassland? They did, and he got the Kiowas to agree to it. So this is the son of one of the cattle barons, Burke Burnett, of the 4 Sixes. And of course, we know Burke later on, lived in Fort Worth. All those old cattle barons were generous people. And Burke would buy lunches for the school kids, and And then Tom became wealthy too, a wealthy cattleman. And he lived in Iowa Park the last few years of his life, just outside Wichita Falls. Every Christmas Eve, all the dry goods stores stayed open in Iowa Park, and the poor people got what they wanted. And the stores charged it to Mr. Burnett. All right, so this is Quanah and Tom. And so I heard this story from Tom's banker, who was 96 when I interviewed him in 1984. So this man told me, Tom's banker said, you know, Burke took Tom to West Point because he wanted him to be educated. But before Burke got back to Texas on the train, Tom was already back. And he was home when Burke arrived. Burke was not a happy camper. So he took Tom over to Quanah's. Now, meanwhile, they had the grass lease thing had gone through, and they had built Quanah this magnificent home that I'm going to show you in a moment. The cattleman did. He and his wives had been living in teepees down by Cache Creek, which was no problem. That was their way of life. But so Burke takes Tom over to Quanah and says, I can't do anything with him. See what you can do with him. So Tom learned to speak fluent Comanche, and he taught Quanah a lot of things about the cow business. And they were tremendous friends. So Quanah and his friends, his family members, they would come to Fort Worth to the Fat Stock Show. And in 1910, Quanah came to Dallas to the State Fair and made a memorable speech. And he was riding around in an open-air automobile, and he had ridden down here on his train, the Quanah Acme Pacific, from Quanah, Texas. I'll show you that slide in just a moment. Now, are we talking about a remarkable man or not? He was the oldest child of the union between the captured and the captor. His mother, captured at the age of 9, became his mother when she was about 17 or 18. And the father was Chief Nocona, Peta Nocona, who captured Cynthia Ann. He was quite a lot older than she was. And if you've read Ride the Wind, it's a romanticized version, which just turns my stomach. I want history, and we've got enough romance and enough mythology. I'm sure they were in love, but she was not his only wife. All right, so anyway, this is Quanah and Andrew Jackson Houston, son of the great Sam. So it seems like Quanah was attracted to it seems like great men wound up, and Andrew, young Houston became an Okie, kind of like I've done. And I guess I'm a hybrid because I've lived in Texas and Oklahoma all my life, except for 2 years in Idaho and 3 years in Saudi Arabia. That was a trip. Now, one of the reasons I talk about cultures and collision is because I lived right in the middle of one. I taught Saudi Arabian students English. I drove in that town. I went to the market. I knew how to get my insurance. You had to have $15,000 worth of blood insurance in case you kill somebody on the street. Anyway, that's another story, except that it's consistent with the way I look at cultures. We don't say that somebody was good or somebody was bad. Those terms don't apply. We just look at what people did, why they did it, and what the consequences were. Okay, this is Quanah's incredible home, built in the mid-1880s, while the white people in that area were living in half dugouts and shacks. This is a mansion. It even had a telephone in 1907. I saw a letter in the Fort Sill Museum. Your telephone wasn't working when I tried to call you the other day. This was in the letter. That's the only reason I know he had a telephone. Okay, so I was at that house yesterday for a funeral of a great man. His name was Herbert Wesner. And Fort Sill expanded the artillery range in the mid-50s, and they condemned the land on which Quanah's house was sitting. Quanah died in 1911, but one of his daughters was still living there. And I got to interview her daughter later on. But so Mr. Wesner said, I'm not going to let them destroy that beautiful home. So he bought it and moved it to Cache, Oklahoma, in a little area behind his store. And it's been sitting there ever since. And he passed away recently. And the funeral was at Star House on the lawn in front. And the Comanche Nation Funeral Home is the one that did the funeral. Their hearse, their ambulance, their limo for the family members. There were as many Indians there as there were white people. A unifying influence. Herbert Wesner. It's so appropriate that funeral was held at Quanah's house. It was very touching. Mr. Wesner gave me lots of information. One of the things that if there are any young historians or any historians, and I know there are in this audience, please get out of the libraries and talk to people. The oral interviews are very important. Okay, this is Quanah's family. His oldest daughter married Emmett Cox, the father of the man who wrote the foreword to my book. And Mr. Cox said that his father had to learn Comanche because his mother would not allow English in the household. So there you're going to find some Indian faces that look traditional. You're going to find some Indian faces that show that there's been some very, very refined education. Like the young ladies that went to Carlisle, you can see who they are. 2 white son-in-laws and those beautiful children. But Quanah was still a Comanche, always a Comanche, totally. His adaptations were to a different culture. And no, he did not speak English. He did speak English, but he didn't learn it from his mother. His mother had to forget it because when she was recaptured after 24 years with the Comanches, all she knew was me Cincy, me Cincy. That's all she knew. And but Quanah Parker loved his mother very much, and he was 13 when she was recaptured, and she did not want to go back to the white people. So see, again, what are we talking about? Culture. We're not talking about race. We're talking about culture. Tom asked me at dinner, incidentally, he knows I love Thai food, so that's where we were just before we got here. He asked me about the language and this type of thing, and why the children didn't want to go back to their white parents when they were ransomed. Well, the Comanches never spanked the children. They were spoiled. They were cherished. They didn't have to go to school. They didn't have to go to church. They had lots of fun. And so if you ever read my book, you will see the regard that these former captives had. This, I met a distinguished gentleman a moment ago who used to be a doctor in Quanah, Texas. I used to be an English and Spanish teacher in Quanah, Texas. This is the Quanah Acme and Pacific Depot that's been restored by the people of Quanah. The town was named after Quanah Parker, by the way. And I've written a screenplay, which I'm trying to get produced. My professor is at the University of Oklahoma, my screenwriting professor. And, you know, I'm probably as old as just about, I'm 72. So if anybody of you if you still want to do something in life, do it. I'm writing another screenplay now. And anyway, my professor polished my screenplay for me. He charged quite a bit, but he polished it. And we have, I love the scene that I wrote, which he didn't change. It's Quanah in Quanah, Texas. And he is blessing the town, and there's this engine locomotive with his picture on the front of it. He was an investor in that railroad. Now, isn't this an incredible story? And it's like Tom said, you know, there's just not another story like this. And we don't need fiction with this story because truth is stranger than fiction. All right, this is the greatest, I think, of all the frontiersmen, Charles Goodnight. I wish I had a different photo. I mean, another one when he was younger. This man was a Texas Ranger from Parker County, nearby Parker County. He was in the National Cowboy Hall of Fame. They've renamed it in Oklahoma City. His is the first name on the list of great Westerners. It deserves to be there. He befriended Quanah and gave Quanah some herd bulls to start his own cattle herd. And he did a lot of research on Quanah's history. And I found this information in the the Charles Goodnight papers in the Panhandle Plains Museum. A lot of people have ignored Canyon. Don't ignore Canyon. There's a lot of information in that museum. And I found things there that nobody had ever used. One of the professors at Texas Women's has used my Quanah Parker collection up there, all my research papers. And so a lot of people are using those, and I'm glad. But I put them in Canyon on purpose because the Texas Panhandle is a part of the state of Texas. I want y'all to know. And we're in southwestern Oklahoma as a part of Oklahoma. I'd like for the folks in Oklahoma City to know as well. They sometimes act like those places are just hinterlands, but you know, that's all right with me. Now, this is Tom, as I mentioned, there's been Tom and I have talked a great deal, and I just think he's done a marvelous job as your cultural point person. And for all these programs, but he was talking about Quanah as a spiritual leader. Here you see this. This is after Peyote prayer meeting. I met one of the leading Peyote roadmen. That's what they're called, the people that set up the prayer meetings at the Comanche Homecoming Powwow, which I attended several times over the years. His name was Red Caudina. Okay, so I would get to talk to him, and he might tell me a little bit, and then just stop. All right, as aggressive as I am, I knew better than to push. So I had to wait until the next year, the next Comanche Homecoming, for the next conversation. I would have heard a little bit more. So finally, I was getting weary of this, and I thought there's got to be he's got to have a weakness. And I knew what it was. Cedar with red berries from the Paladera Canyon area. So I found out that he lived in Surreal, Oklahoma. And I went outside of the canyon and got some scissors, and I got a whole bunch of cedar with red berries. Okay, so when you burn that, the smoke becomes sacred, and the eagle feather fans that smoke and drives all the bad spirits away. Besides, it smells good. Okay, so I go to his house, and this young lady comes out. No, my grandpa's not here. I said, well, tell him that I brought him a whole bunch of cedar with red berries from Palo Duro Canyon. I'm going to go get a Coke. I'll be right back. He was on the porch when I was pulling up. He told me everything that time. Took me in the back room and told me everything about the Peyote religion. So I didn't have to wait until the next powwow. All right, this is Quanah again, a very distinguished person. And the Comanche men were very vain, okay? Are you beginning to get this idea? Want to look good, okay? And the women were wanting them to look good. They were always beading things and, you know, sewing beautiful things for them. And, okay, this is Quanah and two of his wives. And I changed something from my first book. I didn't have an easy time with any of this. I had to self-publish the first Quanah book. I was totally unknown. Still am relatively unknown. And so my hometown newspaper, the Texas Panhandle, published my first Quanah book. And I took a copy of the Dallas Morning News, and miraculously they reviewed it favorably. And my 3,000 copies sold out in 14 months. And then 7 years went by, and I had given up on getting a new publisher. And I got a call. I was teaching in Quanah, Texas. I got a call from Denver, Colorado. This guy said, I have a friend in New York that wants to publish a biography of Quanah, and I picked up your book, and I think it's the one. Sure enough, that's what happened. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, would I? And so I credit my higher power with the book, with the publication of the book, for this wonderful experience in visiting with you. Oh, but the first book had what I think really happened. Quanah was always bringing in these orphan boys. And so his cousin, Charlie Hart from Texas, went over to Oklahoma to live with him. Charlie became a very loyal cowboy on the ranch. Well, Quanah turned up missing, and he had 4 wives at the mansion at that time. And so the wives wanted to know, they were all swimming in the creek, and Charlie was nearby, and they wanted to know where Quanah had gone. And Charlie says, oh, I don't know. Well, 2 of the wives sneaked up on him, grabbed him, and threw him in the creek and were ducking him. And they were threatening to drown him if he didn't tell, because they were mad. Now, this idea of the harmonious polygamy, I really don't believe, because these Comanche women, you didn't mess with them too much, if you know what I mean. 2 of them got mad and left, okay? All right, but anyway, I think he had run off with Tanarsi. I've forgotten which one she is. One on the left or the right. One of them is Tope. And when he got back, Quanah had to give her husband a Winchester, 2 matching horses, a carriage, and $100. And everything was okay. She was one of his wives at that point. All right, but see, when the Coxes read that story came from Charlie Hart. So Mrs. Cox says, that's just an old cowboy story. That didn't really happen. So I took it out of the one that's going to be, that is out now. So Mr. Cox looked at me and he says, I can't really believe that you did that. I says, well, he's your grandfather. Of course, I didn't believe. I believed what I had already written. But sometimes you just have to make compromises. I took it out. They were thrilled out of their mind that I took it out. And so Mr. Cox says, would you like for me to write the foreword? That's how that happened. But anyway, He did like the ladies. Okay, these are some Comanche men performing a dance. I don't know. It doesn't look like a war dance to me. But whoever did the notation on it probably had no idea what it was. But anyway, Lawton has been in all of southwestern Oklahoma. Has been a real interesting place for Indian dances. The powwow is considered by some Native Americans to be not a very nice term. So I will refer to them as dances, okay? Because I don't mean any disrespect. But I like to go to the dances. I like to hear the drum. I like to see the costumes. I just like to talk to the people. It's just wonderful. And it's not that far away. Exotic southwestern Oklahoma. It just grabs at my heartstrings. All right, at this point now, I don't want this to be a lecture. So let's start with the questions. Anybody have any questions? And we'll still see images, but any questions? Yes. That I don't have that in the book, but certainly I do believe that's true. And when Quanah was invited to Teddy Roosevelt's inauguration, Geronimo was invited too, but he couldn't go unless someone supervised him, and that was Quanah. Quanah supervised him. Quanah fortunately did not have a problem with drink. Quanah was a very devout Peyote. He didn't worship Peyote, he worshiped God, the same God that all of us worship, a single God. The Comanches they only had one God, still do. And the Peyote is like the sacrament. And so Quanah was very devout, and people that belong to that church are not supposed to drink. He didn't. One time when they were coming from, he had a train with him and his friends, and they stopped in Henrietta on the way from Wichita Falls to Fort Worth. And Quanah went around and gave all the bartenders money to close. His Indians didn't get any booze on that overnight deal. And when Teddy Roosevelt was visiting Quanah, that's Quanah and Tenorsay. This is Cynthia Ann, but I'll show you the picture of the president with Quanah in a moment. Teddy Roosevelt was at the Star House, that same house I was at yesterday. And some of the girls from that had gone back east to school were helping with the dinner, along with the traditional sisters that had not gone to the white man's school. And so they walked in and they saw Quanah filling goblets full of wine. They said, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, when I was in the White House, Teddy gave me little bitty glasses of wine, and I want to be generous and give big glasses." So they all had a little laugh out of it, and they had to explain to him that they were supposed to be little glasses. This amazing man had generals at his home. The reason he painted the stars on the top of the house was to show his standing. Because if the generals had stars, he did too. All right, this is the photo taken of Cynthia Ann Parker after she was captured. Now, she was not Cynthia Ann Parker at this point. She was Nauda, someone found. Her Comanche name, Mr. Cox told me what her name was and what it meant. someone found. Okay, so this is her little baby, and the Texans, we Texans, love to just exaggerate. So there's a little marker up there where she was captured called Battle of Peace River. It's not a battle when a bunch of men are shooting women in the back. It was the massacre at Peace River. So Cynthia Ann would have been shot. Nauta would have been killed, but she had a cradle board on her back, and Captain Ross restrained from the sergeant that was going to shoot her and the baby. All right, so you're thinking, oh, but Bill, that's just a horrible story. Well, let me tell you what created that story. Some Comanches had gone down into Parker County and had tortured and killed a pregnant woman. And Charles Goodnight and some of the neighbors found out about it, and they began to follow the Comanches. And they found this woman's Bible, Mrs. Sherman, near where the Indian women, see, this is what happens in war. The innocents are victims. So the Texans were hot for revenge. Now, I think at first they didn't know that these were women that were packing up their horses with the buffalo meat ready to go back to camp. I don't think they knew it at first, but they knew after a while that these were women. They killed them anyway. So, again, without being judgmental, one act leads to another act that leads to another act, and then it just keeps on accelerating until you have this ugly, ugly, horrible 40-year war between the Comanches and the Texans. And it was really, really bad. Of course, the Comanches had to deal with disease and just wave after wave of epidemics. Smallpox, cholera. Their numbers just dwindle from about 30,000 in 1832 to about 2,500 when Quanah came in 1875. And most of those people were not victims of gunshots. It was disease. This is Quanah with Dummy, his driver. I met two of Quanah's granddaughters that lived in Lawton, and they told me many stories. One of them was a retired teacher. The other one had been a professional singer. Like she sang once with the St. Louis Symphony. We're talking about an extraordinary family, the Quanah Parker family. Okay, so their two granddaughters told me about this man driving the stagecoach. He couldn't speak and he couldn't hear. But good-natured and good-hearted Quanah gives him a job driving Quanah's stagecoach. So this is Cache, Oklahoma, and that's in that same town is where his house now is and where I went to the funeral yesterday. Okay, this is the wolf hunt. I think they were coyotes, but whatever they were. Quanah was trying to delay losing all of their land. They had one piece of land left called the Big Pasture. So this is 1905, and Quanah's trying to get the president to delay breaking that up. So here they are, and the great Burke Burnett's there. Burke Burnett, I'm sorry. I have to try to pronounce it correctly. And there's a general or two in there. And then in my book, I talk about at the end of the wolf hunt, they're riding back to Frederick to get on the train. And Frederick has become a farmer's town. And that was one of those places where the farmers and the ranchers really did almost come to serious gunplay. So Wagoner, Dan Wagoner, that the ranch up by Vernon is named after, he says, you know what, why don't we just ride through town one last time like a bunch of cowboys hell-bent for leather? So they did. They roared through the streets of Frederick, and people were jumping onto the boardwalks, And one woman says, "My God, that's the President of the United States." So they just loved, boys will be boys even after they grow up. So they had a lot of fun. And Quanah was around famous people all the time. This is Cynthia Ann's headstone. At the time, it was at Quanah's ranch. Actually, Quanah had given the Post Oak mission some land for a mission, and they had a cemetery there. And so after Quanah spoke in 1910 at the State Fair of Texas, he goes back and he contacts Goodnight, and he says, I've got only one more thing left to do in my life, and that's to bring my mother's remains back. See, she died only 5 years before he came into surrender. And he inquired about her and found out that she had passed away. Actually starved herself to death because her white family would not let her go back to the Indians. And as I explained to Tom over dinner, we can't criticize the white Parkers for not letting her go back. The Comanches had killed her dad, her grandfather, her uncle, and some other members of their church. And they hated the Comanches. And so they were not about to let her go back. And she did not like them. She tried to escape all the time. Again, we're not talking about race, are we? We're talking about culture. Okay, so he did finally get her back. And 2 weeks later, he was in his own grave right next to hers. And right now, their bodies are in a beautiful, they're interred in a very beautiful cemetery at Fort Sill. Geronimo's grave is just outside of Fort Sill, well, actually on Fort Sill property. And the Quanah Star House is at Cache, which is 12 miles west of Lawton. Does anybody have any questions? Because I'm an old teacher, and I know that people get tired after a while. So do you have any questions? Pardon? He's buried up at Antelope Hills on the Canadian River somewhere. And he did not, Sul Ross did not kill him when Quanah's mother was recaptured. He lived another 2 or 3 years. He was seen at Fort Sill and at Fort Gibson. But nobody will ever know where his remains are, or Quanah's grandfather, Iron Jacket, who was also a great war leader. Yes, that was Quanah's grandfather. So you can see that he came from, on the Comanche side, very strong leaders. And then on his mother's side, these were pioneers that were very, very brave. And they furnished some of the leaders in early Texas. Daniel Parker became a member of the Texas government. There were several ministers in the family. And so it's a distinguished family. And on both sides of the family, he was, there were great leaders and intelligent people. They will start as soon as the weather is beginning to warm up now, and you can contact the Lawton Chamber of Commerce or the Comanche Nation, and they will give you that information. It is really something, and of course we have the Museum of the Great Plains is there, the museum at Fort Sill, and the old buildings that were built in the early 1870s are there. And it's just a beautiful military installation. I've only been there back for 2 months. I saw an ad in the Fort Worth paper for an academic advisor at Columbia College in Fort Worth, and I went over for the interview, and they hired somebody already on staff, and the lady said, well, we're opening a new campus at Fort Sill. So I got my foot in the door. So I'm academic advisor and administrative assistant for Columbia College in Missouri. We have 32 campuses and 16 of them are on military installations. So I do bring you greetings from all the other colleges at the Truman Education Center at Fort Sill. We're in the process of educating our soldiers, and many of them online. Some of my students right now are in Iraq and Africa. And so even today, when I look at Fort Sill today, it is still, the soldiers are still there, just like they were during Quanah's time. Quanah became very good friends with a lot of the generals and the leaders there at Fort Sill. The Star House is crumbling and it needs to be restored, and Mr. Wesner would not let anyone do anything to it. And I suspect now that the Oklahoma Historical Society will probably get a hold of it, move it to a museum area where people can see it, hopefully in Lawton. I'm willing to help them do that now, but I was a friend of Mr. Wesner, and people approached me one time and said, well, why don't we try to force it? I said, you better go talk to somebody else. I said, he's my friend, and I'm not going to do anything. The Comanche Nation might decide to buy that. We don't know, because they were very prominent at the funeral. So they could. Well, let's be honest about this. Not all the Comanches like Quanah, because some of them are jealous, frankly. The Quanah Parker family is very interested in Quanah, and some of the other Comanches are, and some of them are not, because that's just the way it is. And I will be speaking in Lawton soon, and I have to be very sensitive to that. And if I have any anti-Quanah Comanches in the audience, I won't argue with them. I'll just let them, I'll say you're entitled to your opinion, and I'll go on. If they try to argue with me, I'll have security take them out. I'm not putting up with people who hate Quanah. He's my hero. Any other questions? We are his name. Mm-hmm.
How was Quanah Parker known? What was he called in his early years?
His early years was Quanah, and then when he became a teenager, he exhibited tremendous skill as a horseman and as a hunter and as a warrior. So his daddy set up the Eagle Dance, and his adult name was Eagle.
So when did he become known as Quanah Parker?
Excellent question. Okay, so he goes in 1875, and he meets Colonel Mackenzie, who's the commander at Fort Sill. And so they talk to each other, and Quanah had learned English from a captive that he chose not to torture. He was smart enough to get this guy to teach him English. And so then Mackenzie finds out that Quanah's mother had been captured. He does some research, finds out that she's dead, but what her family name was. See, Quanah didn't know what that was. So Mackenzie calls Quanah in and says, I found out that your mother's family name is Parker. Quanah says, okay, that will be my name too. I am Quanah Parker. It's a good question. I didn't get it the first time around. Any other questions? Why didn't he take his father's name? I'm repeating the question. I should have been doing that all along. There was no family name with the Comanches. Peta Nocona means he who leaves alone and returns. So there was no way he could do that.
The jealousy between some of the Comanches and Quanah, does that go back to the fact that not all the Comanches were wanting to lease land to the Texas cattlemen after they went to the reservation?
Most of the Comanches were for it. A lot of the Kiowas were against it. There was a lot of prosperity brought to the Comanches by the grass leasing. Every 6 months they got a payment, and those were very good years for the Comanches. That's why Quanah hated to see it. No, the main part came that when he came into the reservation, the white people in charge did not realize that the Comanches were not a unified tribe and never had been. It was a series of bands and band leaders, loosely sort of allied confederation. And they wanted a single chief, like the Choctaws had or the Chickasaws. And the Comanches were not culturally ready for that. And they put Quanah in as the top chief because he could speak English and he was sharp. And I think also because his mother was white, frankly. And I think that a lot of the Comanches living at that time really resented it. Although a lot of them were for it, a lot of them were against it, and their descendants just kept on maintaining the same attitude. And there's one other thing, and that is his mother was a captive. In my screenplay, I have Quanah taking horses to the father of Wekia, who was his first wife. And this is a true story. And I just put it in the screenplay more dramatically. The father rejects him because he's the son of a captive. So they just elope. They run off. They go down by San Angelo, that area that there was nothing there then except buffalo. And Quanah and some of his friends about his age, they formed their own band. And the father-in-law found out later, that he was still mad, but he rode down to see Quanah, and they smoked the peace pipe and went on a raid, probably down toward Parker County or Palo Pinto County, and got a bunch of cattle and horses, and they were friends after that. There's nothing like a raid to put things back on top. Especially when that's your culture and, that's how you get honor. And we don't know how many people Quanah scalped, but I'm sure there was quite a few. Quite a few. And, after all, why not? He was fighting for his own country. The 14-year-old junior high kid in Oklahoma City, whose mother did housekeeping for the Coxes, he got a hold of the book, and he goes to his school, and he does a report, and he tells the teacher, well, these people weren't savages. They were just fighting for their country. 14-year-old could see that that's what it was. That's exactly what it was. But see, if you've got people coming in that want that country, they're not going to say they're human beings. Call them savages. It's easier to take it away from them that way. Call them heathens. Right now, I'm writing a book on what happened to the native Spanish-speaking people in the Texas Revolution. I'm writing a biography of Juan Seguin. They couldn't wait to get those Tejanos off that land. Whatever they had to do to get them off, kill them, assassinate the family leaders, these things happened in our history. It's a very violent and ugly history in many ways. And when we see someone beautiful like Quanah emerge from it, when we see someone who can make the adjustment and become a bridge builder, and see that was his legacy yesterday at the funeral, it's appropriate that that funeral was at his house because that was a mixed group of people. And you're going to find that in southwestern Oklahoma a lot. That's why one of the reasons I like being there. I feel culturally comfortable. I miss all my Spanish TV stations. When I lived in Fort Worth, I had 7 or 8. I've got 1, and I just miss the Hispanic part of me that just craves Texas, and the Indian part of me craves Oklahoma. So I can't have both of them.
Was the Colonel Mackenzie the one that discovered Quanah as his family name? Is that the same Colonel Mackenzie that slaughtered all the horses in Paladuro County?
Indeed, yes. And the reason that I found the letter from Mackenzie to his superiors in the National Archives, and he gives the reason for killing the horses. In an earlier battle, see, they had the Tonkawa scouts. The Tonkawas were cannibals, and the Comanches hated them. So one of the worst things that the whites ever did to any Indian tribe was to get the enemy Indians to track them and fight against them. But anyway, I got sidetracked. The horses. So a bunch of horses had been captured at a battle, and the Tonkawa scouts were supposed to guard them. The next morning, the Tonkawa scouts went into camp with a burro with a bunch of saddles piled on top of it. The Comanches had stolen every single horse in the night, right from under the Tonkawa's noses. And so Mackenzie knew when these horses were captured, there was no way the Comanches were the top horse thieves in history. He didn't want to do it, but he did. That's why he did it.
As a follow-up, didn't they give some of those scouts the horses?
Oh yeah, the Tonkawas got the best horses. Later on, the Comanches got even with the Tonkawas. There was a big massacre up in Oklahoma.
Any more questions? I'm going to ask one last question, but before I do, I wanted to say that we have a limited number of hardback copies of his book that we're going to be selling in the meeting room. The list price of the book is $24.95 plus tax. Our price, our suggested donation is $20 with no tax. Every penny of the profit goes to help finance these programs. And before we I asked my last question, I want to introduce Marianne Smith. Marianne Smith is with the Adult Services, and she's building our local history and genealogy collection. And she has gathered together books on Native Americans. They're available for checkout, where we will have the book signing. If we run out of books, which I hope we do, we can order some more and get him to sign them at a later time. One reason you should buy this book, there's materials in the book that are in no other book because the Quanah Parker family gave him some access to letters and diaries that they gave no one else. Right here is where you see it. My last question, what if the Council House massacre had been a Council House peace conference? What impact would that have had on Anglo-Native American relations?
In 1840 in San Antonio, some Comanche chiefs and women rode into San Antonio to meet with the Texans to discuss getting prisoners back. The Comanches had captured some women and children. So they get to the council house, and so the whites are upset, the Texans are, because they didn't bring any captives with them except for one. This one little girl, her face, the tip of her nose had been burned off. She had been disfigured and tortured terribly, and she was only like 12 or 13. So this was an electric moment for the Texans, who, didn't really need too much of an electric moment to fight, because that's what they did. So one of the Texans asked the Chief McGuire, where are, the others? And he made some smart aleck reply and said, how do you like that answer? Well, so then the Texans started shooting and the Comanches started shooting, and it was a horrible situation. The Bayard County sheriff was killed outside in the street by a Comanche boy. There's no way that the Council House massacre would not have happened. You have two cultures in collision, two warrior cultures that were not going to talk to each other. There was only one Texan that would or could talk to them. That was Sam Houston. The Spanish had a man that could do that, but they were rare. Very, very rare, because most of the Texans that came out here just wanted the land. I mean, they weren't Texans to start with. They were mainly from the Mid-South. But we have to, and then they use the term manifest destiny to try to bring God in on it. God is not in on these aggressive things. I mean, I don't think so, not from what I can tell in the Bible. So they made up, it's our manifest destiny to control this whole continent. Well, I don't think so. The God I know probably didn't like that too much. It's a nice word for greed. And one of my friends in Oklahoma, who is, she's been on the board of the Oklahoma Historical Society, she said you never used the word greed at one time in the book, and talking about what the whites did to get the Comanches land. I said, no, I didn't use the word. I just showed it. Good writing shows it. And so I've got to say one last thing. I was in Oklahoma. I was in Lawton for Lawton's 100th birthday. And I'd set up a group of meetings like this one, speaker meetings for the whole year. And then I had a panel discussion on what happened to the Indians after allotment. Because if the allotment hadn't happened, Lawton couldn't exist. So I had a representative of the Plains Apaches, the Kiowas, and the Comanches, and I was the moderator. There were 8 white people in the audience. The rest of the audience was Indians. We had a nice program. And then I go to the Lawton Constitution and I say, aren't you going to do any journalism, any investigative reporting on what happened to the Indians so that Lawton could be? No, they were not going to do that. That's wrong. Because what people did 100 years ago is one thing. But for us ignoring the plight of these people and not even being curious about what happened to them. So what I told the editor was I could write letters to your paper, but y'all would just edit out the things that you don't like. I'm going to try to make a movie. And I'm going to make you the viewers so interested in what happens to the Comanches that they will feel for them. Then they will understand on an emotional level that this was a really, really bad thing to do. But anyway, it's the council house thing was just, it was inevitable.
Any other last questions? One last question.
I have a comment. I really want to thank you for your attentiveness. I'm very honored that you asked me to come and talk. I have never given a speech in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. This is my first time. The book came out in '95. So I really appreciate you for being the pioneers in this area and asking me to speak. And I certainly wish you well, and I look forward to seeing some of you after a while.
Mr. Neeley, it's kind of interesting that the Anglo colonists in Texans could not get along with the Comanches, yet the German colonists came down and pretty much had a good relationship. One other point, though, was that the Comanches had been very successful in intimidating the New Mexicans and striking deals with the Pueblos that they thought also they could intimidate the Texans the same way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. And the reason the Germans got along is that the Germans did not see them as savages. The Germans saw them as human beings. The Germans were educated and they came from Europe. They were not slaveholders. Their whole attitude about race was different. They did make peace. For the most part, there were a few little flare-ups, but their whole concept of life, frankly, if you'll excuse me for saying so, was on a higher plane. And my own ancestors were in Texas in the 1840s. So, and I'm not German. Okay. Thank you.